There's an idea that shows up in psychology, in philosophy, and coaching, and it's that what you focus on grows. Where your attention goes, energy follows. Whatever you feed expands.
We usually hear that as motivation. Focus on your goals, focus on what's good, put your energy into what you want more of, and that's true, but this applies to everything. When you focus on someone's faults in a relationship, they seem to grow and become bigger. And when you lock onto a problem, a regret, a conversation that went wrong, a version of yourself you can't let go of, you're not just spending time and effort to think about it, you're feeding it. You're making it bigger. And your brain, doing exactly what brains do, keeps sending more energy to these thoughts.
And most of us have felt that. When something isn't worth the mental energy you're giving it, you tell yourself to stop thinking about it, and somehow that makes it worse. Today, we're talking about what happens when that focus turns inward and gets stuck, what the science says about why the brain loops, and more importantly, what you can actually do about it.
Welcome to the Mental Fitness Podcast in partnership with NUE, that's NUE, where we explore real tools and stories for building mental strength in the modern world. So let's start with what we're actually talking about. Most people call this overthinking, but there's a specific clinical term for this, and it's rumination. Rumination is repetitive, passive focus on the causes and consequences of negative feelings without moving toward any resolution. You're not solving anything, you're just circling. And it might feel like you're working on something, it might feel productive, like you're learning from a past or figuring yourself out, as if just thinking about it long enough or reviewing it enough times in your mind over and over again is going to cause some breakthrough.
Exactly. That's the trap. Rumination feels like thinking or processing feelings, and that feels like progress sometimes. So you keep going, but there's a big difference between just reflection, which is active and should move somewhere, and then rumination, which is passive and just loops. So how does someone know which one they're doing?
That's a good question. Ask yourself, have I had this exact thought before, more than once today? If you're covering the same ground without landing anywhere new, that's rumination. Reflection shifts over time. Rumination doesn't. We all know people who seem to be stuck on the same problems for years. And honestly, sometimes even professional therapy can feed rumination if the therapist just lets you stew over the same issues for an extended period of time. And this is why we wanted to do this episode, because this isn't just a thinking problem, it's a mental fitness problem.
And the reason that reframe matters is because mental fitness, as we've talked about, is about capacity building. It's an active process. And the antidote to rumination isn't less thought, it's more life. And we'll get into exactly what that means here. But first, let's dive into the science, because I think once you understand what's actually happening in the brain, it changes how you approach this.
Yeah, the first thing worth knowing is rumination isn't just a symptom of depression. A researcher at Yale named Susan Nolan Hoeksema, I hope I pronounced that right, she spent decades studying this, and she found that rumination actually predicts depression. It predicts how long it lasts, how severe it gets, and whether it comes back. So, same heart event, two different people. One ruminates, one doesn't. One seems stuck and unable to move on, and another somehow is able to move on. Very different outcomes. And I've actually seen this firsthand with siblings who have been through abusive situations and family trauma. They've been through the exact same experience. It happened together, and yet sometimes there's a split where one is able to deal with the trauma and heal and move forward in life, and that experience almost shapes them into a stronger person, while another sibling who went through the same thing just gets stuck in rumination, and it hinders their future progress. They keep thinking over and over and over again about the bad thing that happened to them.
So it's not that depressed people ruminate, it's that rumination is a part of what creates and sustains that depression. And that's actually good news, because it means this is something you can change. It's not a fixed trait. It's a response pattern. One way you can think about it, it's not the wave that drowns you, it's staying underwater after the wave passes.
Yeah, it's a good analogy. And we've all done this to varying degrees. Honestly, we've all been stuck on something longer than was healthy. Sometimes we look back and realize the original thing wasn't even that bad, but the more we were stuck on it, the more it grew in our minds and became distorted. Where does the loop come from? Why does the brain do this?
Yeah, there's something called the default mode network, the DMN. It's the part of the brain that activates when you're not focused on a task. Mind wandering, daydreaming, self-referential thinking. Essentially it's your brain's background process. In people prone to rumination, the DMN gets strongly linked to the regions tied to negative emotion, the amygdala, the insula. So every time your brain goes idle, it doesn't go to a neutral place, it goes to the loop.
Interesting. And which is why it happens when you're driving or in the shower or when you're trying to fall asleep. It's the moments where your brain isn't fully occupied. And important framing here, that's not a character flaw. Your brain is running a program it's been trained to run. It's a habit that's been formed over time. The question is, how do you retrain it? And that's important to say because a lot of people beat themselves up for not being able to stop when they're in a rumination loop, which, as we'll get to in a minute, just starts a whole new loop.
Yeah, rumination is a habit. That's probably the most important idea in this episode. Rumination is a learned response pattern, which means it can be unlearned, right? It's trainable. The research on CBT and behavioral activation consistently shows that engaging in goal-directed action, even just small, low-stakes tasks, is one of the most effective ways to interrupt the cycle. The brain cannot sustain the rumination loop you're in when it's genuinely engaged in something that demands attention.
Yeah, so when people just keep busy, there's actually something to that. When, it's like you just got to get busy doing something to get your mind off it. I mean, and that's, the science supports that. But it's more specific than just staying busy, because that can also just be avoidance of something that you need to process. It's behavioral activation. It's doing something that gives you a sense of accomplishment or agency, like running an errand, finishing a task, exercising, getting outside, not with the purpose of distracting yourself from the problem, but because you're creating a competing neural demand the loop can't survive alongside.
Yeah, you can't think your way out of rumination. You have to act your way out.
I want to push on something here, though. So, because I think a lot of people's instinct when you're stuck in a loop is to call a friend, to talk it out. So, question, Luke, is that a good idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. Sometimes yes, and also sometimes no. So the research is actually pretty clear on when this can backfire. Amanda Rose at the University of Missouri studied something called co-rumination, where two people extensively rediscuss the same problem together. And what she found was that it did make people feel closer to each other, but it also significantly increased anxiety and depression. That's
really interesting. It might feel like meaningful connection, but it's actually extending the loop. It's not healthy overall. But the intimacy reward, that feeling of real connection with that person who co-ruminates with you, that's real. You can feel like you're heard. You can feel understood. You might feel close to that person. But if nothing's shifting, and if you're telling the same story to the same friend for the 5th or 100th time, and you're still in the same place, that's not processing, that's co-ruminating. What's the difference then between a conversation that's helpful and one that's co-ruminating?
Yeah, this was an interesting learning. A helpful conversation moves you towards something, a new perspective, emotional release that actually settles you, a decision. An unhelpful conversation actually just validates the loop. and keeps it going. So the question to ask yourself then is, after this conversation with this friend or a therapist or whoever it may be, do I feel lighter? Do I feel more stuck? So not every listening ear is an exit from the loop. Some are actually an invitation to go deeper into that loop.
Interesting. Okay, so rumination feeds depression. It runs on autopilot when we're idle, and it can actually be reinforced by conversations that we might initially think are helpful. But here's what I love about this topic for our podcast specifically. The anecdote maps almost perfectly to the 3 pillars of mental fitness that we've been building across all of our episodes. This isn't one fix, it's a well-rounded mental fitness practice. So let's get into exactly what that looks like.
The first pillar we'll touch on here, and there's no really specific order of pillars, but health and vitality. And this is probably the most immediate, actionable thing. We also have a whole episode on this for health and vitality, but as it relates to rumination, exercise or movement doesn't just boost mood. It changes the physiological state that rumination depends on. So when you do movement, exercise, that cortisol drops, that default mode network we talked about quiets. So behavioral activation interrupts the loop at a biological level. It's not just motivational talk. This is an actual mechanism.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it doesn't have to be a full workout, intense, extensive training. The research isn't saying you need an hour at the gym.
Exactly. It could be as simple as running an errand, doing the dishes, going for a walk around the block. These small task completions that, like you said earlier, Dave, they restore a sense of agency. And that's exactly what the rumination loop erodes. You feel stuck. You feel like things aren't moving. A completed task, even if it's just a small one, like those examples we listed, is evidence to the contrary.
I think it's so interesting that you might feel stuck in life on some traumatic experience that happened. And one way to get out of that loop is to clean off your desk, right? You might think, like, how's that at all related? But when you have a sense of accomplishment, it's changing what's happening inside the brain. And it actually, it actually does. And then with, like you were just mentioning, with physical exercise, there's 2 things. You feel a sense of accomplishment, but then the physical activity itself is also changing the chemical balance in the brain. And sleep is in this pillar part of health and vitality. We've talked so much about it. I know we talk a lot about sleep, but that's because it's so important. It's often overlooked as part of the solution here.
There's some nuance here because what happens is these 2 can just, rumination and sleep can spiral together. You can't, imagine scenarios when you can't turn off your brain at night. So your sleep tanks. And then because you're running on empty the next day, your brain is even less equipped to pull out of that loop. So you're exhausted, which makes you less equipped to manage your thoughts, which then makes the loop even worse, which keeps you awake. So think about that. The last time you were lying awake, turning something over and over in your mind. And now think about the same situation when you were turning over and over in your mind and how you felt the next morning after really good night's sleep. The problem you were thinking about probably felt different. It typically doesn't carry the same weight after a good night's sleep.
Yeah, almost always. And what's interesting about that is because when you're lying in bed falling asleep, that's a time when your brain or your mind is idle, and that the rumination loop is susceptible to returning. And then you get all worked up about whatever it is you're ruminating on, and then your stress level goes up, and now you're less tired, and so now you're less likely to fall asleep. And you said it really well, but sleep, as we've talked about in so many different episodes, impacts so many other aspects of our physical and mental health. So rumination can be really harmful in and of itself, but when it starts to disrupt our sleep, now we're just creating a whole bunch of derivative problems from the rumination. I think it'd be safe to say that if you're in a ruminating state in your life right now, that poor sleep will feed rumination, and rumination can disrupt sleep, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. All right, so that's health and vitality. The second pillar, mental fitness, connection to others. Let's move into that. We already talked about the co-rumination trap. And so what does the right kind of connection actually look like? The goal isn't to find someone to process with endlessly. It's connection that pulls you out of your head. Presence, laughter, shared activity, being genuinely engaged with another person. These aren't distractions from the problem, they're the medicine.
Yeah, and there's a loneliness piece here too, because isolated people ruminate significantly more. Loneliness and rumination feed each other. We've talked about this many times, but connection to others isn't a nice extra for mental fitness. It's necessary for breaking the cycle.
Yeah, what I've learned with connection to others, particularly as we were talking about rumination or other aspects of loneliness and depression, is that when we're inwardly focused, we're very susceptible to rumination and to depression. We become insular. However, what I want to emphasize here about connection to others is it's not finding someone else to listen to our problems or finding connection to serve our needs. The most powerful antidote to rumination and loneliness and depression is finding meaningful ways to serve others. Yes, we do need to connect with others and to be heard and understood and to feel seen. That's an innate need that we have. And when we connect with others, that need is being filled. But our focus shouldn't be on filling our own need when we're trying to connect to others. It should be on serving others, not how others can help solve our problems. The happiest people that I've ever known are those who live a life of service towards others. And in my own life, the happiest periods of my life have been when I'm engaged in serving the needs of others. And I've seen that as a father, when I'm focused really on the needs of my kids. That seems to be like the periods of time when I'm really happy. So when we serve, we become outwardly focused, which is the exact opposite of rumination.
And the research actually backs that up. Dr. Stephen Post has studied what he calls the helper's high. Acts of service activate reward pathways and reduce self-focused thinking. And the reason makes sense. You genuinely cannot ruminate and be fully present to someone else's need at the same time. The attention has to go somewhere. Service, like you said, redirects it outward. We talked about Viktor Frankl a few episodes ago. He talked about this too. Meaning through contribution is one of the most durable antidotes to inward suffering. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And then you start asking, what can I do for someone else? It totally flips where that energy goes.
Right. And you don't always feel like serving others when you're struggling. So it's not always easy to do, but I love that you cited that science, that study by Dr. Post, because that's been my experience, right? It works. That brings us back to the very beginning of the episode, like what you said at the beginning, Luke, what you focus on grows. And service is one of the most powerful ways to redirect that focus. There's also a nice side effect. When we serve others, it almost always has a positive effect on our relationship to those people, which strengthens our connection and strengthens our support network. So it's not just a way to break out of the rumination loop, but we're building more meaning in our lives.
So we touched on health and vitality, some examples there, connection to others, and now to the third pillar of mental fitness, connection to self. This one's a little more nuanced when we're talking about rumination, because we just talked about how focusing outward is an antidote to rumination. And there's a version of self-focus that actually does make rumination worse.
Yeah, and honestly, when we were preparing for this episode, I had some concerns initially about connection to self even being part of the discussion on rumination. It felt almost contradictory because rumination is an over-focus on oneself. So how can focusing on connecting with ourself be part of the solution. And, but the hyper self-analytical person who's constantly processing their feelings, that's not helping either.
Yeah, an over concern with how we're feeling is its own problem. What we're talking about here isn't more introspection. It's the kind of self-awareness that creates the distance from the rumination loop rather than being more immersed into it.
So what does that look like, Luke?
Yeah, there's three things we'll talk about. First is observation, the ability to notice when you're actually in the rumination loop itself. That's the first exit, is observation, being able to say, I'm ruminating right now. It's fundamentally different from being inside the rumination. You can't exit the loop that you don't know you're in. So that one step back is key. It's almost like watching yourself from the outside.
That's actually the second tool here. Dr. Ethan Kross calls it self-distancing. So when you're deep in the loop, shift from first person to third person. So instead of asking, why can't I stop thinking about this? And, I'm Dave, and so I would say, why is Dave stuck on this right now? And that seems like a small shift, but that small linguistic shift creates enough cognitive distance for your prefrontal cortex to re-engage. It sounds strange, but the research shows that it works.
So observation, and then you just explained self-distancing. And the third one is labeling. Name the specific emotion, not just I feel bad, but is it shame? Is it fear of rejection? Is it grief you're going through? Mark Brackett and others have shown that this kind of precise labeling activates the prefrontal cortex and dampens the amygdala. We talked about this in the emotional intelligence episode. Rumination is exactly where it matters most. And if you want more practical tools on emotional labeling, what we're talking about here, head to our website, mental.fitness. In the resources section, you'll find one thing is the emotional literacy vocabulary guide, where you can dive deeper into this. We'll link this in the show notes as well.
And then gratitude fits here too. And this is where it connects back to what we opened up with. Rumination trains the brain's attention toward threat and what's wrong, towards problems, negativity. Gratitude trains the same attentional system towards what's present, what's good, what's positive. And Robert Emmons, his research shows consistent gratitude practices reduce negative effect over time. So you just have to name something specific and real that you're grateful for, and that act alone begins to redirect the energy. So what you focus on grows. That works in both directions. So no one's life is perfect. We all have problems. We all have things. It's just, what are we focusing on? Are we focused on the negativity, the problems we have, or can we, amidst trials and challenges, recognize things that are actually well in our life and be grateful for them?
So a connection to self here, it isn't endless self-analysis. It's a targeted, brief intervention that creates distance from that loop and redirects attention. That's the nuance and the distinction. You're in and out. You're not camping there.
All right, let's make this concrete. When the loop starts, here's a simple framework. We're calling it the 3 exits. So you're in this loop. How do we get out of the loop? 1 exit from each of the mental fitness pillars. So let's walk through them.
Yeah, exit 1, move your body, health and vitality. Walk outside, something as simple as doing the dishes, make your coffee, go to the gym, change your physical state. The loop cannot sustain itself when your body is genuinely engaged in something.
And exit 2 is connect with intention. This is connection to others. Reach out to someone. But to be clear with yourself about why. It's not to vent. It's not to spiral. It's not to find a co-rumination partner. If you catch yourself in this loop, reach out to someone to be with someone. The goal is re-engagement with the world, not deeper processing of the loop. And serving others, even better. That's the connection with an outward focus built in.
And then exit 3 is name it and step back. This is where we just talked about connection to self. Say out loud or write it down. I'm ruminating because of XYZ. And then ask, what would I say to a close friend in this exact situation? Distancing yourself from that emotion is the antidote.
Yeah, so the rule is simple. When the loop starts, pick an exit and act on it. Don't try to engineer the perfect response, lower the bar. Just make it simple. Lower the bar for yourself. Move, connect, or name it. Try all 3 at different times and see which one seems to work best for you. For me, it's definitely serving someone. That's what I've learned in life. For you, it might be exercise. And what kills the exits, Luke? Like these are all good ideas, but where are we gonna run into problems?
Typically, it's avoidance that feels productive, where you're continuing to analyze, continuing to discuss the same ground, waiting to feel better before you take action and do something. Right? That's not an exit. That's more loop. If you take nothing else from today's episode, the next time you catch the rumination loop running, just pick one of these exits. That's it.
All right, this show is all about mental fitness, and here's something most of us don't admit. Everyone has those moments when you feel overwhelmed, stuck, or unsure, and what's actually going on in your head. That's why we built New. New is a mental fitness platform designed to help you clear your thoughts, reflect, notice patterns, develop habits, and get support that fits who you are. It remembers your goals, your wins, the things you're working on, and helps you stay on track. Not therapy, not toxic positivity, just real support when you need it. Head to talkwithnew.com. That's talkwithnue.com. Let's talk about where people can go wrong, because even with the framework, there's some common ways that this falls apart. The first one is thinking you need to solve the problem before you can stop looping on it. And that's actually what the rumination problem is you're just thinking over and over about the problem. Breaking that loop is not solving it. Rumination feels like you're about to land somewhere, so you keep going. But in reality, the resolution rarely comes from within inside the loop. It comes after a break, after some sleep, after some movement, after you've given space and distance yourself from it. So give the brain room, and the answer often surfaces on its own.
The second is when you confuse rumination with processing something. They could feel the same from the inside. Both involve revisiting hard things, but the test is whether you're moving. Processing shifts over time. New insight, emotional release, new angles. Rumination circles the same territory over and over again. Same thought, same feeling, same loop. If you've had this exact thought 3 times today, that's not processing.
Being able to distinguish those two is really important. The third, this is the one we talked about, venting to the wrong person. It might feel like meaningful human connection, but it can actually make things worse. So find connection that pulls you out, not in. And if you need to genuinely process something verbally, a good therapist is oriented toward moving through, not just revisiting. Good therapy breaks the pattern. It doesn't indulge it. Therapy itself, however, can sometimes feed the rumination loop. Not all therapists are good, honestly, and most therapists would agree with that statement. Some therapists have built a nice little business where their clients feel better after each session, so they keep coming back, but they're not actually getting better. And so if you've been talking about the same things with your therapist for an extended period of time, and you might feel better after the sessions, but if you're still dealing with the same problems, you might consider mixing it up a little, maybe exploring a different therapist, honestly.
Yeah, that's a good point on therapy, Dave. And this connects to something Dave and I see a lot in the work we do running an AI company in the mental fitness space. One of the patterns we see all the time is people using general purpose AI like a ChatGPT as their primary place to vent and process. And we've talked about how talking things out can be good. We've established that. But here's what's different about venting to, a general purpose chatbot that's not purpose built for this use case, especially mental health. Those general purpose systems seem really smart, but they're designed to be reassuring. They validate you. They make you feel heard. They give you this, thorough, thoughtful wall of text response that feels like progress. And there can be a real dopamine hit in that. You come in with a problem, you get that wall of text that explains your feelings back to you, makes you feel validated, and you feel better temporarily. But most of the time, nothing happens. No action, no actual shift. And so you come back the next time, let's say, for example, to ChatGPT with the same thing, which is exactly why the loop we've been talking about, right? You're feeding that loop. It feels like processing, but you're just feeding it, and it's actually a very agreeable co-ruminator that's available 24 hours a day, never pushes back. A general purpose chatbot that just validates everything you bring to it. It's not that. It's the bad therapist problem you just talk about, but it's automated with a chatbot.
I like that. The bad therapist, the automated. There's a real danger in using AI systems that are not designed for mental health support as our therapist. And I know countless people who do. Some even have built a nice project or a custom GPT for this, and they love it. They have something to vent to, and they go through and they feel better temporarily. And it might actually be helpful for some, like long-term potentially, but really there's a real risk here in creating a rumination loop. Like you said, Luke, AI systems are designed to be reassuring. And so they're very susceptible to confirmation bias. They're designed, what an LLM is, it's a prediction engine, and it's trying to predict what you want. So it's designed to tell us what it thinks we want to hear. But that's not good therapy. It feels good, but over time, it can actually cause rumination and even make other mental health problems worse. And now I say that, ironically, as someone who leads an AI mental fitness company. I believe AI is a powerful technology that can help us in so many ways and should be deployed in helping us address so many of the difficulties with our current mental health status in this country, with the mental health industry. It can help in so many ways, like dropping stigma barriers, lowering cost barriers, increasing accessibility, both in availability in rural areas, removing language barriers. There's so many ways, the 24/7 availability, there's so many ways where this technology can be really powerful and meaningful. And I wouldn't be running the company that Luke and I do if I didn't believe that this technology has the potential to change billions of people's lives for the better. My caution is to be careful when just using a general purpose AI system, something that's not designed for this purpose, particularly if you're susceptible to ruminating. Endless chats with ChatGPT can actually feed that and make it significantly worse.
So there's lots of ways the loop stays alive without you realizing it, we just covered. But here's what I find encouraging here. Some of the most well-known, high-performing people in the world have dealt with exactly this. And they've talked openly about what it actually took to get out. And it maps closely to everything we've been talking about today. One example is the globally famous singer Adele. She's a good example of this. After her divorce in 2019, she talked openly about replaying the same thoughts over and over, feeling embarrassed, telling herself she didn't do a good job, even though she knew no one else saw it that way. The loop was entirely internal facing. Now, what pulled her out wasn't thinking her way through it. For her, it was movement, hiking, gym sessions. She even said sound bath. She called it a throw everything at it approach, which is kind of funny. But she even quit drinking for 6 months, specifically because she noticed alcohol was amplifying the loop the next day. It's what she called the hangxiety, she called it. The physical state was feeding the mental one. Once she addressed both of those, the rumination lost its grip.
Yeah, and it's interesting the effort that she went to fix that. Another example is former ABC News anchor Dan Harris. He famously, and you may have seen this, he famously had a panic attack live on Good Morning America as a news anchor. Dan was a very dedicated news anchor. He was very dedicated to his craft. He was hyper vigilant, and those characteristics, they helped him to become successful, but they eventually led to a mental breaking point. And he talked about the rumination loop in a book that he later wrote about his experience called 10% Happier. And in his book, or he writes about this, he noticed that by sitting in meditation, he was able to recognize when his mind started to drift into a loop. So we talked about how rumination happens when your mind is in like a passive, restful state. And that's exactly what meditation is. So he noticed that in meditation, he could start to recognize when his mind was starting to drift into the loop. And he learned to catch the rumination earlier. And in his book, he talked about this and he learned to rewire his brain to reduce this activity and stop listening to that internal negative voice, if you will. I just thought it was interesting that meditation was the tool he used, but it was really an increased emotional intelligence, an increased awareness of when he entered the loop, which gave him the opportunity to break out of it before he got stuck in there for a long time.
Didn't he also call mindfulness and meditation like his mental bicep?
Oh yeah, that's right. Which just kind of goes along with mental fitness. He called it bicep curls for the brain.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
All right, let's bring it home. Let's recap. Rumination isn't overthinking. It's a passive, highly repetitive loop of focusing on the same problems over and over. It can feed depression. It runs on autopilot when the brain has nothing else to do. And it's not a personality trait. It's a learned habit. The good news is that means it can change.
And the antidote isn't better thinking. It's a mental fitness practice in any of these three pillars: health and vitality, connection to others, and connection to yourself. Move your body, connect with intention, or serve someone, or name it and step back.
Yeah, first you have to recognize it's happening, like we just talked about, and then you can exit the loop with one of these strategies. And the principle that ties it all together: what you focus on grows. Rumination is proof of that, but so is the way out. The way out of your head is through intentional living.
So here's one question we want to leave you with today. What's the loop you keep coming back to? And which pillar of your mental fitness has been most neglected? That's your starting point.
Right, and if this episode resonated, share it. If you know someone who would benefit from today's episode, share it with them, and we'll see you next week.